saying good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to wherever you are. We are approaching evening on the German side at least. And I would like to welcome you to the session on behalf of GIZ and obviously all the co-conveners of the session today. As you're aware, and you probably already participated in a lot of sessions, today is dedicated to finance and governance issues in the week. And we're here looking specific on the aspect of exploring results-based contracts for reliable rural water services. Our main question we are focusing on, how can this be financed and which results can we achieve through them? GIZ has for a long time focused on urban water and sanitation services, but not least due to SDG 6 and to leave no one behind. In the last years, the question how to achieve sustainable services within the rural areas has become more prominent again. We are therefore very happy to support the Uptime consortium that has been explored over the last roughly one and a half years through a lot of groundwork, how really on a rural level that could be achieved. And what's very interesting for us is that they're working in a combination of academia, engineering, and service providers on the ground to see how that can work out. We definitely need to put more resources into infrastructure, but the adequate maintenance on water services, especially in the rural context, is even more important maybe. We have seen that too many development funds are spent on new capital expenditure rather than the maintenance of existing assets. And we have too long been stuck in this vicious circle that all of us have seen before of building, neglect, and rebuild again, especially in the urban and the rural areas. Therefore, we were happy to jointly strengthen this international policy dialogue that we have started and that Uptime has started on innovative approaches that address the need and make the case for sustainably maintained and financed solution for the water supply in rural and remote areas. And I think this this very in-depth session on how or what has been explored by the Uptime consortium will give a new push on putting that on an international level on the dialogue, and also to see who is going forward and pick that approach up and invest in it. And with that, I would like to hand over to Duncan McNichol, who is going to guide us through the session. He's the director and co-founder of Uptime with more than 10 years of WASH experience in Africa, Asia, and South America, where he has directed governance programs, managed professional rural water maintenance services, and led also academic research. Currently situated in Tanzania, as we already heard. He's going to moderate and also give an input together with the consortium partners. I wish everyone interesting, fruitful session, and thank you very much.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Katrin. It's a real pleasure to be joining you today. And once again, a very warm welcome to everyone joining us from around the world. Today I'll be taking you through the session on results-based contracts for rural water services. I think we've got a great session for you, and we really appreciate you taking time to join us because we know everyone's busy. We'll start with just a couple of notes on the session. We are recording the session, as Katrin mentioned, I believe. The recording will be made available afterwards. So to help us with that, please ensure that your camera is turned off and that you are on mute if you're not speaking. I'll start with just a little bit about what Uptime is. We are a working group that has come together around the shared challenge of funding rural water maintenance services at scale. This global consortium consists of these 5 service providers you see here and Oxford University, and we're working to deliver drinking water services to millions through long-term performance-based funding. Our overall objective is to establish a funding mechanism that can ultimately scale to eventually fund services for 100 million people by 2030. And today, we hope to take a small step towards that goal by doing 2 things in this session. The first is to consider a results-based contract design for funding rural water services at scale. This draws on the recent work of the consortium and our recent working paper. And then from that, with your input, we'd like to identify key questions to answer during our upcoming pilot phase of these contracts. And I'll talk a little bit about that during the presentation. We'll use this agenda as a rough guide for the session. We will first have an overview of the results-based contract design that I'll take you through, and then we'll get some brief remarks from two groups of experts. First, we'll hear from our service providers, and then we'll hear from two experts on WASH finance that will help lead us into the discussion, where we'll get your input and answer questions and try and identify how we can take this initiative forward. The story of this work starts about 18 months ago, as Katrine mentioned, when the consortium came together to do two things. The first was to look at data, to see to what extent could we take different types of services in different places and somehow make sense of their operational and financial performance using common metrics. And then if we could do that, to what extent could we develop an investment case to attract more resources for rural maintenance services? And at least on the first part, it seemed like we were able to succeed on some level. We were able to identify some key operational and financial performance metrics that we were able to gather across these different services, including the scale of infrastructure maintained, the estimated population served, the reliability of the infrastructure, and the financial performance, specifically what are users paying, and especially in proportion to the, sorry, I just had a brief power surge, but I think we're back. What are users paying in proportion to their operating costs? And if we look at their performance in 2019 across these four countries, Burkina Faso, Central African Republic, Uganda, and Kenya, they maintained about 2,800 water points serving an estimated 1.2 million people. The uptime of the infrastructure was about 94%, so that's uptime, not spot functionality, and about a 20 percentage point improvement over the regional average. And users paid about 30% of the total operating cost, or about $330,000 US. But we learned we could put together this type of dashboard with these performance metrics and a few others. We also learned about the financial performance of these services, specifically that multiple factors influence levels of cost recovery, and that most service areas do not break even on operating costs. There's lots more detail on this in our previous working paper that I encourage you to access on our website at the link below. The key point here is that there was a real variation in the proportion of operating costs that were being covered by local revenue. We first approached this from the perspective of blended finance. Could we put together some sort of investment case to attract investors that might get some sort of financial return? In some cases, that's clearly possible. In other service areas, there seems to still be a long way to go, and there's many, many factors that influence this, not just infrastructure, but equally things like the payment method or the institutional structure. The implication that we take from this is that scalable, results-based concessionary funding is needed to achieve universal water services in rural contexts. And we conceptualize this with the figure you see here, that in some areas, for some portion of the rural population, commercial finance may be possible. Businesses could be cash flow positive in providing their services and attract investors who might get a financial return. As we move towards universal services, last mile where no one's left behind, it seems clear that some level of concessionary funding will be necessary. And so recognizing this is the challenge that we began to grapple with as the point of departure for our current work. And the design challenge we took from this is this: how might we design results-based contracts to deliver reliable rural water services for, say, 100 million people by 2030? And considering a few things in this design challenge. If we're delivering concessionary, so non-repayable funding, how do we make sure it's targeted and transparent and data-driven and scalable? And also, how do we ensure that this motivates service providers to continue improving over time so that we minimize any subsidy requirements? This is what we've been grappling with as a working group over the past few months. And today what I'll be presenting on is the contract design that we've come up with as a possible solution to issuing this concessionary funding for services at scale. I might move through some of this a little bit quickly, especially some of the calculation details, but I encourage you to access the full working paper at the link here and follow up with any other details there. At the core of the contract design that we've developed is something called the Uptime Framework, which focuses on 3 key performance metrics as the basis for results-based funding to service providers. The first metric is reliable water points. This is the quantity of infrastructure being maintained that functions reliably. And this requires service providers to do a couple of things. The first is to do preventive maintenance to ensure that infrastructure doesn't break. And the second is to respond in the event of a breakdown to ensure that water points are fixed quickly. So that's the scale and reliability of the infrastructure. The next part is water volume. This is looking at to what extent is the infrastructure maintained actually being used. And the final part of this framework is a financial piece, local revenue. How much are water users and or local government paying for the service? This is important for a couple of reasons. One, obviously for financial sustainability, but equally as an indication of perceived user value of the service, because we assume that people won't pay for something if they don't see value in it. Taken together, we think that this framework provides a basis of the scale, reliability, use, and perceived value of the service. And these are also quantifiable and verifiable metrics that we could use as the basis for these results-based contracts. And so we build from this framework into a calculation for results-based payments as follows. The first piece is to calculate a results-based payment on a quarterly basis for these three components of the Uptime Framework. The first is a payment for the number of water points maintained, where their uptime exceeds a certain reliability threshold, a payment for the quantity of water produced, and then a payment for local revenue as an incentive for service providers to maximize that payment over time. What's nice about this additive structure is that this is a basic contract design, but future iterations could also include other considerations, things like water quality or coverage or affordability. Another important feature of this is that the results-based payment is calculated after the fact. So first, the service providers deliver the service, they post their results, they submit their verifiable data, and then based on that, their payment is calculated. So they take the implementation risk and then they're paid in arrears. The other component of this is a maximum funding threshold, basically a limit on the maximum amount that service providers can earn above their operating costs. And I'll talk more about that in an example in a moment here. And then the final part are some qualitative sustainability requirements. Things like, the service provider needs to have an established service record. They need to show a track record of their operational and financial performance. They need to show that they're generating revenue from users. They need to show that they have a mandate to operate by evidence of contracts and agreements between users, governments, maybe other service providers. And there needs to be some plan for infrastructure replacement. What we're focused on here is very much the operation and maintenance part of service delivery, but we also need to be aware of the implications of long-term life cycle costs and eventual infrastructure replacement. So that needs to be accounted for somehow in the service model. The final piece is annual progress towards a sustainable service model. Year on year, service providers need to be getting better at what they do. This can be from an operational perspective, from a financial perspective, ideally both, but we recognize there can be different pathways that services follow in the way that they develop. But importantly, we need to see that services are getting better so that a service isn't just doing the same thing year in, year out and accessing a forever subsidy. Let's look at an example of how this would actually work. Let's look here at some actual financial data from one of the operational units of one of the service providers in Q1 of 2019. The yellow bar is the cost that they incurred to deliver that service, and then the orange bar in the income column is what they earned, what users paid for the service. And in this quarter, they didn't generate enough income to fully cover their operational costs. We can then apply the Uptime Framework. We can assume some values for those unit costs, and those are detailed in the paper. And then based on their performance, we can calculate what they would have been paid for the number of water points that functioned reliably, that functioned more than 96% of the time in this case, a payment for the volume of water produced, and a payment for the local revenue. And we can see how by adding that results-based payment, that helps to close that gap between income and costs so that the service could continue to function. In this instance, that total payment would exceed that maximum funding threshold. So here, that little bit above their total cost that would have to be reinvested in the service. So the total payment would go up to that red dotted line. Again, more details about that in the working paper, which I encourage you to look at for some of the assumptions and nuance of this. The key point here is that based on the performance data we have from these service providers for 2019, we can backcast and calculate, well, what if these contracts were in place, what would that have looked like? Based on their performance, how would this help to close that gap between their costs and revenues to allow these services to continue functioning, to allow them to continue developing and invest in optimizing that service? And so we can see that here, how the results-based funding would be added to the income in each quarter to help this service provider meet its costs. But I also want to draw attention to the change in the costs over the course of the year, where we see actually quite a bit of growth in costs over the course of the year, and then equally, although slightly less pronounced, change in the revenue, change in the level of user payments over the course of the year. Again, many factors at play here. Seasonality can be a big issue, more than we have time to explore in this section. For our purposes, what we were looking at is how does this contract structure help to close that gap to allow services to continue functioning? Especially this year, we are all acutely aware of what a crisis looks like, where costs can skyrocket and revenues can collapse, and that might be a time when services are most needed. So what we're interested in is how does this contract structure help to respond to those fluctuations to ensure that if a reliable service is being provided, it has the ability to continue. This looks at one service provider here. We can also look at this on aggregate. So we can look at each of these operational units, each area that was managed by these service providers, represented by these dots here. We can see that without these contracts in place, what level of cost recovery they would have achieved in 2019, both individually and on aggregate. And then we can see how, with the addition of this contract design, what that would have meant. And what we see is that based on their performance last year, this contract design would have allowed all of these services to meet their operating costs and then some a little bit, but that extra would have to be invested back into the service, not taken as profit. And also importantly, it seems as though this contract design works across different types of service models, including different types of infrastructure and different types of institutional arrangements, so sort of different levels of service development, which suggests it might be possible for this contract design to accommodate a wide range of services across many countries and contexts and service models. And so coming back to this dashboard, looking at what these service providers achieved in 2019, if we layer on top these modeled results-based payments, we can calculate what they would have been paid for these services in that year. And the total amount is about 875,000 US dollars, or about 70 US cents per person. Obviously, lots of assumptions here. We're backcasting and looking at a sort of modeled version of this, but we still think there could be something really compelling here. And specifically, we draw two main implications from this analysis. The first is that it may be possible for a common set of contract terms to be broadly applicable for rural water services, and that reliable water services for approximately 1.2 million people across 4 countries would have required a subsidy of about 875,000 US dollars. We think this is the type of value proposition that we could leverage to attract new outcome funders, new sources of funding to come in and invest in the rural water sector. And when I say invest, I don't mean getting a financial return, but being able to show a clear link between how resources translate into results at scale that can attract to new money that we all know is needed if we're to achieve SDG 6 by 2030. But we don't know for sure, and we need to test this. And today, I'm delighted to announce that that is exactly what we plan to do. So we've developed something that seems as though it works on paper, but we are now in the process of establishing the Uptime Catalyst Fund as a UK nonprofit, and this will be the vehicle that we'll use to test these results-based contracts. With the generous support of the Waterloo Foundation, we've now secured £100,000 to begin testing these results-based contracts in October 2020. And then over the next 4 years, we'll target raising a total of $5 million to serve approximately 1 million people annually. So this is looking at these 5 service providers and sort of their current scope of operations. But at the same time, we will absolutely have a view towards scale. So we'll be looking at how do we take what we're learning from this pilot and use that to attract new sources of funding that can commit for long-term results in rural areas. And equally, how do we understand who are other service providers who could potentially come into the pipeline to eventually be eligible for results-based funding? So on both the funding side and the service side, throughout this pilot, looking at how we can hopefully scale from serving 1 million people to 10 and then even 100 million by 2030. But first things first we need to test this contract design. And to look at this in a bit more detail, I'd now like to invite our 2 service providers to join us. We're very lucky today to have Cliff Nyaga from FundiFix and Laura Lambert from Water Mission, who both bring a lot of experience to this. Cliff, I'd like to start with you and ask you to maybe tell us a little bit about what FundiFix does in Kenya, and tell us what implications would these results-based contracts have for your service model?
Thanks, Duncan. So I'll start with a quick introduction of FundiFix. We are a company that provides professional maintenance and repair services in Kenya. We work in rural Kenya and currently serve up to 128 rural water points or communities. Our value proposition to these are our clients. So our value proposition to them is guaranteeing functionality of their water source or water point. And we do that by repairing any failure within 3 to 5 days within a span of that. And we have a performance-based contract between ourselves and these communities to sort of protect that. Just to briefly give our performance for the first half of this year, year 2020, we've so far completed up to 350 repairs this year. And our average repair time is roughly 2 days on average. Yeah, so on the other hand, we are business and we charge communities for our services. This is through monthly tariffs, and currently community payments cover up to 20% of FundiFix operating costs. Of course, that shows we have a funding gap equivalent to roughly 80% of our operating costs. And the key message from me is that tariffs alone are not adequate to cover our full cost of maintenance service delivery. And this, I think, underscores the importance of the results-based contracts model that we are discussing today. Once we have these contracts operationalized, some of the key changes we expect are that they'll incentivize FundiFix to expand maintenance service coverage to new regions in Kenya, which means then we'll be able to guarantee more rural communities a reliable water service, given that payment by contract looks at KPIs such as volume, revenues, and the number of water points. The other important implication will be that the results-based formula is flexible, accommodates additional KPIs, which would enable FundiFix or would allow FundiFix to sustainably address other equally important aspects of maintenance service delivery. Here I'm looking at aspects around water quality, weather monitoring, treatment, or both. It could also be deployment of advanced monitoring systems, for instance, which would support our internal operating efficiencies, and with also possibility of supporting other national level performance monitoring and regulation of rural water services in Kenya. Finally, contracts would also mean more predictable cash flows for FundiFix, and this would cushion our operations from external shocks. Again, here I'm looking at rural water issues around seasonality of rural water use and payments, as we know. And also currently we're having the COVID-19 pandemic, which has contributed to a significant drop in our revenues and an increase in our costs. Thank you, Duncan.
Great, thanks very much, Cliff. And I'll just note for everyone that our panelists and also other members of the Uptime Consortium will be around during the Q&A. So please save up your questions for then. Laura, could I invite you to respond similarly?
Absolutely, thank you, Duncan. Yes, so just a little bit about Water Mission. Water Mission is also an engineering nonprofit that works in many different regions across East Africa and Southern Africa and Southeast Asia and Latin America and the Caribbean. And specifically for Uptime, we're right now piloting this in Uganda and Kenya. And so we work with a community managed model. It's piped water systems, so typically decentralized piped water systems, working with communities. It's fee-based, so users are paying tariffs for that water. We're looking forward to just piloting these results as well with Uptime. And so I would say, you know, for us, how this impacts our services for Water Mission, really our ability and our accountability to scale. So I'm sure I can speak on behalf of everybody and all the Uptime partners. We're already committed to investing in quality services and data systems, but just the ongoing administration of these come at a significant cost, which oftentimes cannot be fully covered by these user payments. And so it's relatively easy to fund capital investments, but there are currently no reliable funding sources for subsidizing ongoing services. And so for Water Mission, this absence of reliable ongoing funding has limited our ability to commit to supporting more communities. So performance-based funding addresses this gap, and it also incentivizes us to scale up our services. So we continue to do professionalized long-term monitoring and support. And so just this performance-based funding allows us to address that gap in funding and also scale.
Great, thanks very much, Lara. I'd now like to head over to our financing experts and invite Louis Borston from the Osprey Foundation and Regina Rossman from Convergence to speak a little bit about what you see in how results-based funding is evolving in the water sector. And then with the establishment of this Catalyst Fund, what role could we play to help advance sector understanding and innovation? Louis, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thanks, Duncan. Can you hear me?
Yes, very clearly.
Great. Okay, so let me just touch on 2 points here related to the financing side of this. The first is sustainability, and the second is scalability. From the rural customer's perspective, which is the one that matters most obviously, the advantage of the Uptime approach is that it increases the sustainability and actually also the affordability of rural water services. This matters a lot because rural water services are notoriously unreliable, with exceptions of the examples you just heard. But they're typically quite unreliable because of inadequate funding for operations and maintenance. Furthermore, the sort of approach which should be taken, which the partners of Uptime do, but most places don't, is preventive maintenance. That's a pretty common approach in urban areas, but you see it all too rarely in rural areas. So what does Uptime do? Uptime addresses this fundamental problem of sustainability by using the performance-based funding to reward consistent and reliable rural water services. So it attacks that problem directly. And if you want to think about it in a slightly different way, Uptime is encouraging these rural service providers to act like well-run urban utilities because it rewards them for the high quality service and efficient operations. So that's the benefit of Uptime from a sustainability perspective. From a scalability perspective, scalable really matters in this sector because of the scope of the problem. And so if you take this from a broader sectoral perspective, Uptime is scalable for at least 2 reasons. First, Uptime is figuring out how to support a wide range of service providers within a single program. So as Duncan explained in the presentation, this approach should work both for people providing piped water services as well as those maintaining hand pumps. And that's quite a challenge to find an approach that does both of those. The other thing that is really exciting here is that Uptime is figuring out how to use public funds or donor funds from organizations like the one I represent, the Osprey Foundation, but also from places like GIZ, who's sponsoring this, to use these funds in the most efficient possible way. That's a real challenge in the rural water sector because the local costs are so different. Some places are just inherently more costly than others to serve. So if you can figure out how to use those funds in an efficient way, that really helps the donors know that their money is being used well. So from my perspective, the reason we're supporting this and we're very excited about it is that Uptime looks to be well positioned to eventually launch a large-scale facility to support efficient rural water services in multiple places. So I'll leave it at that for now and turn it over to Regina. Thanks.
Thanks, Louis. Yeah, I'm here to complement what Louis said with a few more points. So first of all, I feel like everybody will understand that it's much cheaper to properly maintain pumps and pipes than to build new infrastructure, right? But even though everybody understands that general rationale, it doesn't mean that there is funding available for that proper maintenance, because that maintenance is also costly. It's not that it can be completed by itself. And so what I find so special about Uptime is that they have managed to take this very simple concept, which is it's much cheaper to invest in maintenance than to build new infrastructure. And they have come up with a model on how that can be done at scale and how this can be done by aggregating very different service providers that do that in very different settings. And at Convergence, I work mostly on blended finance, and we mostly see that a lot of these new models that are coming up require a long time to be set up. And that's a lot of times because it's very hard to raise that first bit of money to come up with that model. So in Duncan's case and with Uptime, to get that Catalyst fund registered in the UK, to get it up and running and to develop all the pieces of the puzzle that are needed, this will require money, right? And it shouldn't be that hard to get that money, but unfortunately it is. And so what I see with the Catalyst Fund is that it has a great prospect to really aggregate service providers, put them all together, and then raise funding for all of them at once in order to pursue that ultimate idea of supporting maintenance rather than building new infrastructure. And to me, that is a very, very important idea and one that deserves to be pursued. And so I look forward to seeing Uptime and the Catalyst Fund be established and thrive in the coming years.
Great, thanks very much to both of you, Regina and Louis, for those great comments. I'm delighted that we still have a good bit of time remaining in the session for questions and answers and discussion. And so I'd like to invite the panel to be available along with some of the other members of Uptime that you see here to respond to questions you have. And I'd like to invite you to help us identify some key questions that you think we should be exploring during this pilot phase when we get these results-based contracts up and running. So please type your questions into the comment box if possible, and then we'll do our best to aggregate them and pull from there. So we have our first comment, or our first question, which is, will results-based funding needed forever, or is there some sort of exit scenario? That's an excellent question. And what we are looking at, the short answer is right now, we don't know exactly what that pathway looks like for each service provider, but our assumption is that there's a couple of different ways that these service providers could and should exit from needing this external subsidy over time. I had a slide on this, but I'm not sure if I'll be able to set it up on the platform just now, but it's in the working paper. And so what it shows is that imagine if a service provider is at a certain level of cost recovery, and then over time under this funding model, it's able to optimize its services and improve performance, and perhaps the context improves, and eventually it can become viable, and then it no longer needs any subsidy. It can just function as a business. In other cases where long-term subsidy is needed, ideally that would be transitioned to local government. And by that point, the value of this would be to make the empirical case to show what results can be achieved, what they cost, what that funding model looks like, and then transition that to either a local government or a national government authority. So we're very much looking at those types of exit strategies. But that's absolutely something that will need attention as we look at year-on-year performance of services over time. Katrin, I might have you help me aggregate some of these questions as they're coming in.
Sure.
Yeah, would you be able to read them out as they come up?
Sure. Philip just asked whether you could elaborate a bit on how the approach can incentivize that local revenues increase over time and how to engage and tap into local public funds for a transition. So going a bit more also into exit strategy region.
Great. Cliff, could I invite you to speak to that question a little bit, especially the experience of the trust fund in Kenya as well, and what that local funding type of model could look like?
Thanks, Duncan. So what we have in Kenya is a funding gap of roughly 80% of FundiFix operating costs, as I mentioned, and that funding gap is covered or underwritten by a trust fund in Kenya that has been set up to demonstrate how a sustainable funding mechanism could work for water maintenance. So the trust fund attracts funding from private companies and partly investors, and funds administered from the trust fund to FundiFix through performance-based contracts. So FundiFix signs a periodical contract with the trust fund to deliver on X KPIs, which range from number of water points, reliability or downtime of these water points, and other internal operating efficiencies. And on basis of achievement of those KPIs, then FundiFix receives a funding to cover the gap in a given funding cycle.
Then we have two questions regarding which providers you basically support. So do they require a certain level of preparedness for you to support them? And in the trial that you're proposing, where are you going to focus? You're going to focus on the poorest or near credit-worthy customers, utilities?
Sure. So looking toward the initial group that we have was just sort of organically emerged from conversations between service providers to see, can we come together to address this challenge, and then going forward, when we look at new service providers coming into this, the requirement would be that there'd be some track record of operational and financial performance. So we have specific indicators that we track on a quarterly basis, and those need to also capture the reliability of the infrastructure, so the uptime, which is specifically we need records of what water points are being maintained, when are breakdown instances, so how quickly are they maintained, the finances, and then also an overview of the services. We will also be adding indicators in the near future about institutional relationships, and then we may also set up some water quality stuff. So the conditions for future entry, which we still need to refine, would be something around having some minimum scale, and then having a track record of that data for at least a year or two, so that we could benchmark, we could sort of project what level of funding would be needed for that service. And then the second question, will the trial focus on the poorest or the near credit-worthy customers? We're going to look at the full spread of this, because the context is a little different everywhere. The thing about the near credit-worthy thing, so some of those could actually exit and might not need results-based funding. But I think even at that top end, there still can be challenges and volatility, where even if it's close, there still can be a need for results-based funding. The difference at that end of the spectrum being that the amount of subsidy is actually very, very small. And so it represents, I think, a decent value for money argument. Thierry, I couldn't remember from the participants if you're here. Would you like to speak a little bit about to that point at all?
Yes, I'm here. Good afternoon, Duncan.
Oh, great, thanks, Thierry.
Okay, good. Just to be a bit more on the broad side, I mean, it's clear that the ultimate goal of Uptime is to get rid of the subsidies. The idea is how long will it take and what will be the different steps to get rid of that. We really have to build confidence between the operators and the users, and that's why once we have the capacity of building that confidence over time, then consumption will increase, and on the other hand, tariffs may be decreasing. So to attract even more consumption, we are in a virtual cycle, I would say, and it will take time. Our experience is that it will take time to educate, I would say, the people and the government that there is a change in the model as compared to what they were used to having in the rural water supply sector, and the management with the at community level will have also to change. And this is this time where we need some support and some, I would say, some help to really change the rules, to make a paradigm shift, as people are used to saying, to make sure that people really, beneficiaries really understand the new model, and then based on that understanding can really attract and accept the new approach where they have a real role to play, and they are not only beneficiaries, they are consumers. So they have to pay for a service, but on the other hand, they can really require some performance from the operator. So this is this gap where we need the support from Uptime Catalyst Fund to make sure that one day, and I hope maybe it will be 4, 5, 10 years, I don't know, then we will get rid of the subsidies, and we shall be in an autonomous model even in the rural water supply sector. And that's, for me, that's the ultimate objective. And what is existing, we have to slowly change the rules and make the people understand that this is how things will happen in their interest, but we are also expecting something from them if we want the model to be working.
Great, thanks very much, Thierry. I'm glad you were able to come in and comment on that. I think we probably have time for one more question before we wrap up.
We have 2 left in the chat, so maybe we can do quick answers.
Sure.
So one is regarding how the model can be used for community managed services, especially if they're, for example, not responsible for all the billing collection, but only for some of it. That's the one question. And the second is, how will the Catalyst Fund fit into different national sector setups, so also on an institutional level?
Okay, great, thanks. Oh no. Laura, could I invite you to respond to that? Since Water Mission has, I think, quite an interesting model with how your service support interacts with communities.
Absolutely, yes. So I agree. I think, one of the things that Water Mission has focused on over the last 8 or so years is really building up these community managed models and professionalizing our community based organizations to do daily operations and maintenance for these systems. And so, really trying to incentivize the community for, reliable water points, for water production, for the local revenue collection. And if we're able to incentivize them and be able to provide this preventative maintenance and this professionalized long-term service support, then it also allows us to come in and only collect that fee for maintenance. And so I think it's a two-way street with community-based organizations. Is how do we professionalize them and incentivize them for this for uptime and water production and local revenue, but then also allows us to be able to come in and support them long term. So it's definitely important for us to professionalize our community managed systems and our community managed committees. But then also realizing that there's a gap in just that long-term administrative needs or long-term technical needs. Sometimes when needs come up 10 years down the road, we know that communities might need a little bit more professional support, and that's where we can support them.
Thanks, Laura. And then this next question on how the Catalyst Fund as a pilot fits into different national sector setups. So at present, and in its nascent pilot stage, this would be so situated in the UK, and then this would just fund the service providers directly. And then the expectation is and will be that these service providers all have relationships with relevant institutions as part of their mandate to operate. And then so the initial relationship between the Catalyst Fund and the service providers is as it would be for any other international funder. Going forward, this is an area of keen interest for us to understand, well, how could a multi-country funding mechanism begin to engage with national institutions and maybe even begin to set up funds within country, and we start to devolve this type of funding model either regionally or nationally. But at the outset, basically the first hypothesis we're testing is to say, well, rather than individual foundations or philanthropists or bilaterals funding these service providers, if we aggregate that and issue that funding under a common model, does that reduce some of the transaction costs and find some efficiencies? And then if that's a potential pathway for scale, then I think that will pave the way for us to look at how the Catalyst Fund specifically will interact with some of these different national sector setups. I'm also happy to talk more about that separately, so please be in touch if you have any other questions, and yeah, I'd be happy to follow up on that. I think we do need to wrap up. So I will firstly, yeah, just summarize the next steps. We are launching the Catalyst Fund, and we'll be looking to fundraise for that over the remainder of the year, and then we'll be planning for growth in the long term. But first things first, we'll test the results-based funding model. And I'll finalize with saying thank you everyone for joining us, and a big thanks to all of our partners. This is, even though I had the pleasure of presenting today, this is the culmination of work from a lot of people, and we're very grateful for the support from GIZ, the Osprey Foundation, VTOL Foundation, and then the Waterloo, who's coming into the Catalyst Fund. And I invite you to check out our website for the working papers, and to please be in touch with your comments and questions. Thanks again, everyone. It's been a pleasure.